Hi, I'm Paul Marcel. Today I'd like to review the 2 horsepower Cyclone dust collector from Laguna Tools. Now I've had my eye on this particular unit actually for quite a while now. I believe it's a relatively new product. There's about a year and a half old, but I grabbed it on a Woodcraft sale since Woodcraft is now reselling Laguna tools, and during their anniversary sale you get 10% off tools too, so that was perfect. Now the reason I wanted to get this unit is, it's a Cyclone, so you're going to have a little bit better chip pickup. It's going to do a lot better separation, and in my case the previous unit that I had was was just a Harbor Freight 2 horsepower dust collector, which is really DIY friendly dust collector, super great to start out with. So there's nothing against that. This is better for my purposes, but it's a single stage, so it would often get plugged up very easily if I was trying to do cleaning of things like if I do hand planing, I want to clean up all the chips that are on the ground, all the shavings, and those, if they go in really fast as a big bunch, they'll tend to plug up the impeller. Whereas in a Cyclone like here, the Cyclone action that's in this top canister is going to let all those parts drop out of suspension of the airflow into this nice 30-gallon can that's at the bottom, and then it leaves only the really fine dust to go into the filter unit, the canister that's in the back. So it's a much nicer design. The whole Cyclone thing is a much nicer design for any dust collector. But this is just a really nice compact unit with a lot of nice features to it. Now again, this is a 2 horsepower model. They do actually make a 3 horsepower model. I did consider that for my shop simply because I thought, well, I had certain performance with my previous 2. It would have been nicer to have a strong one. Now it turns out that this 2 is just so much more efficient with the Cyclone design and just the overall unit than my previous unit that actually this one here is a good step up from my previous 2 horsepower unit. But the 3 horsepower unit is a little bit taller. In my case, it would have really been difficult to find a place in my overcrowded shop to push it into. So it would have been a real nuisance, and that's something I did not want, because dust collectors tend to have kind of a funny shape, so they're kind of hard to put somewhere in your shop. So that's one of the choices, is 2 horsepower versus 3 horsepower. The other choice is manual cleaning versus automatic cleaning. In the back here, we have a filter canister, and I'm going to go through all the parts a little bit more detail here in a moment, but just to tell you the 2 different varieties. This one here, there's a canister back here that's used for cleaning out the fines that didn't get pulled out of suspension. So they're going to go down to this nice canister. Now normally filters are going to start picking up the dust, and they're going to start plugging. So you normally want to clean them out either with compressed air or with a set of slappers. Now this has some slappers on the inside, and all you got to do is give it a crank, which was probably really loud in the microphone. But you give it a little crank, and it's just going to knock all the dust off into a bag down here at the bottom. The automatic one, every time you shut down the unit, it'll spin that for 2 or 3 revolutions before it actually powers down. So it kind of depends on your use. If you had more of a commercial shop, maybe, even if it's a small commercial shop and you had this kind of far away, it might be nicer if during the day it just constantly gets cleaned out. Really depends on your use. For me, if I'm that lazy, I probably shouldn't be doing woodworking. So all the units are 220. This one here being 220, 12 amp normal draw. On startup it can go up, peak out around 15, so you want to put it on a 20 amp breaker to be safe. The other unit, the 3 horsepower, is going to require a larger circuit. So if you have only 110, you're going to need to figure out a way to get 220, and you can usually do that by stealing it off of an electric water heater. You can go and Google that to find out how. So if I were to go over a couple of the features that really sold me on this particular sort of design and layout, partly it is nice and easy to move. You saw that when I was moving it around to show you the back. There's a nice handle on the front of the Cyclone unit, the separator, that makes it easy to pull. And you saw that the garbage can was going along with it. It's on its own set of wheels, and actually what's holding it there is simply the pressure from this top unit being pressed down on the lid. So it'll just follow along pretty nicely. It'll even go over some of my little garage gaps here without too much problem, although I do have those partly filled in my shop. So it moves around very nice and easily. In my case, I tend to just leave it there into the corner, except when I need to pull it out to give that little crank on the filter. Now I also like the fact that this has an integrated remote control. So you get your own remote control with it. It does come with just normal on off, but there's also a timer, so you can run it in 2, 4, 6, or 8 hour timeouts on the DC, which can be kind of nice if you're doing it, if you're working in a shop and you don't want to forget turning it off for whatever reason. If you've got it maybe tucked away in a back room, that might be nice to have. Me personally, I'm not really sure what I'd use the sleep mode for, but it's there and it's available, and it's all in an integrated remote, so it's all built into the power box here. You don't have to like plug this into something separate, which can be kind of awkward with 220 since 220 remotes are a little harder to come by. I guess the one thing I would like better about the remote control is if they had one of those little tiny belt clips. I did have that on a previous remote that I used for my other DC, which was a Lone Ranger remote. It had a nice belt clip, which was kind of handy in the shop sometimes when you're walking around, but it also was a really thin remote which fit nicely in the pocket. This one here is a little bit bigger, but it's not really a big deal. Now in the power box, you can run it manually by just punching the green button, or of course you can use the remote control. It's got a nice emergency switch. If for some reason you come back here and something is going completely nuts, you can just slam the switch. Now it's going to stay down and you got to give it a little turn to release it. So it's nice that it's going to stay down there for you to prevent anything, you know, like say this is in a separate back room if you had a shop and somebody had to mash the emergency switch. The person up front going, why did that thing shut off, and keeps punching the auto start button isn't going to be then turning it on while you're trying to do some work. But of course, if you're back here fixing that, you need to unplug it. Now the design of this thing is all super strong, heavy, thick metal. I was really impressed when I was assembling it. I took a couple pictures while I was assembling it of some of the parts that are on the inside of this Cyclone unit. And what I really like is the really heavy gauge steel that was used everywhere. It's not just thick steel that they then drilled a hole and then tapped. They actually would weld on the back of it, you know, a regular hardened steel nut for any of these screws that are going through and attaching the unit together. That's additional labor during the production process to make this a better product, and I really like that they did that with it. I really don't like it when they just tap holes in the steel because it's too easy to strip those. Now assembling it alone is a little tricky, but you can do it. But then I tend to do things I'm not really supposed to do or should do. So take that into account. This top unit is really heavy. So the way I did it, if you follow the instructions, you tend to build it all vertically. The way I did it is I had it upside down. So I put the legs on it and all that, and then I flipped it myself and then lifted it up onto the base until I got it close, and then kind of wiggled and shimmied it around. Now it does come with a manual. This should be considered a suggested way of putting it together. That's about it. It's at least for me, when I looked through this, I was missing some parts. In fact, when I started doing this review, I remembered that I still owe myself 3 screws I need to go get at the store. So there were some screws that were the different lengths than what was specified in the manual. There weren't enough of them, so I'm not sure if I just got a package like that, but just be aware that when you're putting it all together, there might be some small problems like that. It's not a big deal. At least I don't consider it a showstopper. I go to Home Depot often enough that I can go pick up those screws and I'll put those in. Now it did come with a package of some weather stripping. Now my guess is that the weather stripping is actually for this underside of this lid that I'll be showing you in a moment. When it presses down onto the can here, of course, you know, over time it's going to get hard and it's not going to seal as well. So that's probably what this is for, but there's no mention to it in the manual, so that's what I'm going to be keeping it for. So now I keep pointing to this little can down here, but I haven't shown you the goodies that are down there. It's got 2 nice handles over here. Again, it just presses this lid down onto the can, the 29-gallon can, in order to keep it flowing around with the main unit, and of course to seal off the gap. So you just lift this thing up, it'll lift the can up, and now you can pretty much pull the can out. Now occasionally it'll get caught, you just barely push down on this because it's just floating there. It could be floating crooked, but generally it pulls right out. So it's super easy to get at this can and pull it out. Now you want to use a bag when you're using this. I mean, some dust collectors you might have a can and you don't bother with it because you're just going to dump it into the garbage. But this one here, you're going to want to do that because there is actually a pipe that's connected to the bottom. Now this is connected to the bottom and it's connected up here to the Cyclone unit so that it's actually getting a vacuum to it. And what it's for is, if you look at this whole unit, as the impeller is turning here and it's creating a vacuum over here on the intake, it's also creating a vacuum down here on the bag. So as it's blowing all the air out back into the canister. So naturally what's going to happen is that this bag would get sucked right up into the unit. So what they did is that they put a nice hose on the bottom here that goes into this unit, and it creates a negative pressure and it pulls the bag down into the can. So when it's initially kind of light like now, it would need to have that negative pressure to keep it down into the can. Now I'll take this bag off here. This is one of the bags that came with it, so you want to use some of these clear ones because you have a little window here that lets you take a look inside, so you'll be able to see when the level gets up high enough for you to go and empty it out. So this is hopefully I'm not going to be bricking too many bags like I have in the past. Now I took that off to show you the inside, and you're going to see here that there's the connection for the hose, the negative pressure hose here, and then they put a cage over top the bottom. So the cage goes all the way across the bottom, and what that's for is to keep the bag from basically plugging the negative pressure hose, but then it gives it a chance to pull the bag down everywhere. So it really works well. Now, one of the reasons why you want to use some of these heavier duty bags like they gave you with the dust collector is because, and this is something that'd be easy to fix, is that the screws for the casters come up into the inside of the trash can. So you can see them here. There's one underneath my hand back here and one in this corner here on the bottom. Well, the screws that are sticking out, they can puncture holes in the bag if you have some, cheap lawn garbage bag like I initially put in just to get the thing running, whereas these ones here won't puncture. Now, of course, the few screw heads that stick out in here, it'd be very easy to put just a small round cap on the end of it so that at least if a bag gets down there, it doesn't get punctured. So I was thinking of doing that as a modification, but I don't think it's actually necessary. So if there was one room for improvement, I would say is that it'd be nice if they took this handle that's on the front of the garbage can and put it lower. Part of the problem is you're trying to stretch this bag over the top, and the problem is that here is such a short lip above the handle that as you go to pull it, it tends to pop off. So putting the bag away, very easy. Push it back until you get it underneath and pull down the two handles. It could not be easier. Now this whole unit moves as a single unit again. Now the intake for this unit is a 6-inch diameter port, but they give you a pair of 4 splitters that are on the front of it, with one of them having an integrated cap. And it's very easy to remove. And it does have, some little blockage holes in there to keep too many big chunks from making it in. Fortunately for me, the first day when I assembled this, I was standing here and I thought, I'll just give it a try to see if it powers up. And I hit the button and my shirt just went whoosh, right in. So it's got a lot of good airflow. And actually, once when I was using this initially to go and drain out the dust from the inside of my table saw, and I'll explain that in a moment, what ended up happening is I moved the hose over and it grabbed one of the little tack cloths that I use, which is about an 18 by 18 cloth, and it went rocketing in here and got stuck basically at that little mini plastic grill. What was interesting is that this side was plugged, this side here basically had a big cloth just plugging the whole thing up, and when it went in there, I didn't hear the motor groaning, grinding. The motor didn't back off at all. It was wanting to get that thing into the bag. So one of the things I like about this being a nice 6-inch port like this, and you can do this with any dust collector, of course, a 5 or 6-inch port. What's nice about the 6 is that a 6, basically, if you look at the surface area, is basically a pair of 4s. So when you're splitting this out, you're not compressing it down and turning it into more of a suction. You're getting still a lot of air. Now, of course, with me capping one end, because I don't have a 6-inch hose yet, I'm turning this into more of a suction. I'm getting less of the CFM and I'm getting more of a static pressure conversion. But one of the goals that I have is I want to take, you've seen from my previous videos the sort of elaborate dust collection setup I have on my router table saw combination. What I would really like is to get a 6-inch flex hose directly off of this that goes down to the floor and goes underneath it. And then there I'll build the integrated 6-to-4 splitter, and I'll get just massive airflow underneath the table with just one hose off on the side, nothing to trip over or anything like that, and I'll be getting a greater efficiency. So now the idea of the Cyclone is that this chunks of dust are going to be going in here, flying around, and then gravity is going to start pulling them down into this funnel before they can actually make it out the outside. Now the way that works is that there's a displacement between the intake and then what goes into the filter. So you can see here that basically only fine dust is going to be able to float up in the airflow and get out here into the canister. Now this canister takes care of up to 1 micron particles, so submicron particles might be able to escape, but this is a very good filter. With this type of a difference between the inlet and the outlet, you're not really going to get much of anything out the bag. Now the previous bag that I had, that garbage bag, it was just me wanting to play around with it. My table saw, I normally use the dust collector with a table saw, but the cabinet had filled up with a lot of sawdust because during the winter time I tend to be in here kind of late. So with the garage door opener, I don't really want to run a noisy DC. So a lot of times I'll make cuts without the DC. Well, over the years it filled up the bottom of the cabinet. So what I did as a great test is I threw the hose into the cabinet and just pulled all that in. So what you're seeing here, that would be about 1/8 of a cup of fine dust that's in this bag. So the cabinet on my saw stop was full. I completely emptied that out, and vacuumed it up, and actually since then I've used my table saw with the dust collector quite a bit, and all I have is 1/8 of a cup of dust in this bag. So since it's very easy to see, you're never really going to overflow it. Now the noise level on this DC when it's running is 74 dB. To give that a comparison, if you use like the Festool CT22, the Festool CT22 at high power runs just a hair below 74 dB. So you're really not making too much more noise than this. So there are some signs of improvements that they've made along the way with this unit that you can see from the manufacturing. So down here where these little handles are for pushing down the lid, you can tell that this is something that you're going to probably deal with fairly often. And when you're dragging this around, this is kind of holding the lid and dragging along the bucket of dust. So if you take a look at the plate that's here, you can see that there's 2 holes on the plate off on the side, but there's no screw in them. So I think what happened is probably that's a sign from a previous version, some of the earlier versions. They probably had just holes here and they just used some of these additional screws and they screwed them into some tapped holes that were on this bar. Like I said, I don't really like tapped holes in just the regular metal of the stand and such like that. It's not hardened like a regular bolt or nut would be. So I think what you can see here is that now they weld this in place. So I think they must have found that that was a bit of a failure, and then they went back to the design and they said, fine, just go ahead and weld that in place instead because we're having too many issues with it. And this is going to be much stronger than using some simple screws that are being put into some tapped holes. So I had some high hopes for this dust collector, and they've definitely panned out very well. So give it a look in a store, flip around the switches, maybe kick the tires. You're not going to break it. It's pretty much built like a beast in a tank. I think you're really going to like this DC if you're looking for a Cyclone DC option. So now this dust collector is available directly from a number of different woodworking shops. They place the order directly to Laguna and then they'll get it to you. The reason I'm pointing that out and the reason why I got this through Woodcraft is partly I want to support the store that's nearby. They had a 10% power tool sale that time anyway, so basically it made it that the price was the same as if I ordered it online. And you can see that I have that LT18 from Laguna as well as this joiner planer back here. Both of those were actually ordered directly off Laguna. And all those stories you hear about Laguna's customer service after the sale, there might be a reason for that. Get this thing through one of your woodworking stores.